I'm glad I'm not sort of between you guys in dinner. There would have been a lot of pressure. But I'm going to try and keep this to 15 minutes talking about two things. One, I did a lot of research on yesterday unintentionally, airports. And the second, which seems to cause a lot of consternation, both, lots of, it's like Marmite. You either have a very positive reaction or a very negative reaction. So the second thing I'm going to talk about is Facebook. But the first point I want to make is, this thing I'm standing on, that's a platform. Okay? Unless you think of platforms as something on top of which other things happen, don't use the phrase, don't use the word. Okay? A platform is a foundation upon which other things get built. If it doesn't do that, call it Fred. Whatever you like, but it's not a platform. So first thing I wanted to do, as I said, was talk about airports. And an airport is one of the most enjoyable sort of exemplars of a platform for me, because in its simplest form, it fulfills one purpose and one purpose only, and it tries to do that well, which is it's a place where planes land and take off. Okay? I have been to airports which are fundamentally grass with cattle wire around the edges and a hut that you can either wait in because it's raining or it's too hot, and it's called an airport. It might even have been called an airfield, but the principle is the same. How does an airport from that point on then become a platform? Well, as you scale up a little bit and say, I'm going to have a number of planes land in short order, you suddenly have to say, okay, how am I going to get people on and off these planes? So the concept of check-in desks and luggage carousels came out. How many of you have actually been to an airport where all the luggage gets taken off a plane and there is no carousel in sight? And what you do is rugby scrum your way to the luggage, okay? Now, you can do that with one plane. You can do that with one coach. So scale is what starts leading to saying some standards have to exist, some APIs to the way you're going to get onto a plane, to the way you get off a plane, and to things like luggage carousels. If the containers didn't actually fit to get on a plane when the luggage was there and then when it got off, right? I've actually been on a plane where the door of the aircraft didn't fit the gate that we stopped at, and we had to deplane on stairs as a result. So when you start thinking of standards to do with a platform, right, don't think IT or software. These things exist in atoms terms, not just in bits terms. Right? The APIs, the API for making a phone call for many years was called a digit, a finger in a rotary dial. Right? That is still an interface. We shouldn't get hung up about everything being software, because if we can accept the premise of what a platform is without ever mentioning the word software, we will get further in understanding what a platform is. You scale up further and suddenly you have, in an airport, the idea of international flights. Now you need to know airside and landside. You have immigration, you have customs. You have to create this demarcation line. You scale up a little further, you have so many people there that you need to have, lounges, shopping centers, places of prayer. And before you know it, before you even get to Tom Hanks' level of actually living there for 17 years, you actually have an environment where you have to have people who clean it, to keep it secure, who maintain it. Now, this very, very simple thing that used to be planes taking off and landing has grown like Topsy to be a whole variety of things. And the reason I call that airport a platform is because it fulfills all the characteristics I would like you guys to bear in mind when you think of a platform. Right? There is a single purpose for which it exists that allows attraction of traffic to that place. From that point on, there are a number of things an airport does which have different business models. Right? The airport can decide to take a slice of the action of the duty-free shops, can decide to sell the franchises or rentals for the restaurants, can decide to outsource the cleaning or security of the place. There are a variety of models taking place as to how the platform operator engages with a series of other service providers. Okay? It needs standardization because that airport is not alone. It's not isolated. There have to be other airports, and there are interchanges taking place in human beings and craft and equipment terms, which means if you don't have the standards in place, you can't, you're not a particularly useful airport. And some of the things that take place at the airport actually take place with no connection to the airport operator at all. Right? They take place because multiple parties are brought together, and as a result of their being brought together, things happen. That's the mental model I want you to have of a platform when we try to see how we would have platforms in education. That there is a fundamental purpose for which the platform exists. There are a set of APIs and standards that allow interoperability to take place. There are multiple business models in operation, not all of which involve the operator in the first place, and it is still part commercial and part not-for-profit. Okay? There are many things about an airport that make it worthwhile, even when I spent 10 hours on a tarmac yesterday. Now I'm going to move on to Facebook. I think of Facebook initially as saying it was a failed opportunity for telcos. Because when I try to decompose it, it says everything starts with a directory. Okay? You don't have anything in Facebook unless there's a list of the people there. When you have a directory, directories don't scale unless you have ways of classifying the elements in it. So in the old days, we used to have telephone directories, at least in England, that were, white pages, yellow pages, whatever other pages. You had regional directories, you had alphabetical directories. So the ways of classifying the human beings who formed the directory and grouping them were also very much part of what telcos did. The third thing that happened was, if you have a lock on the directory and you have a lock on the ability to form relationships of the elements in the directory, it makes some sense if you provided some modalities of communication between those people. And though in the old days it used to be the phone and mail, now we've expanded it to involve email and chat and texting and whatever else, but fundamentally, there are a series of modalities of communication. Now, one of the things that telcos always had these three things, the directory, the ability to group, and the modalities of communication. But for some reason, it took Microsoft before the fourth piece of a social network came along, which was the ability to schedule events. Because if you have the directory and the ability to communicate, it makes complete sense that people would want to meet, and an ability to make that meeting easier to have, the Outlook meets Exchange meets directory. Right? Telcos could have tried to do that 30 years ago, 40 years ago, right? In analog forms, but it was missed. And after Microsoft, I watched Google, I watched Apple, still not solving the calendar aspect until very recently. Facebook solved it in event terms. And that's not to be forgotten, that scheduling appointments, events, is a critical part of a social network. That's how human beings get together. If you have the directory, the relationships, the modalities of communication, and the scheduling capacity, it helps if you have some record of changes to them. Okay? In the old days, telcos used to update directories by sending you another 300 trees worth of paper, once every year. Now they call it a news feed. Because all that a news feed is in social network terms is a record of changes, right? He left this company, they left that marriage, this person joined. You're just changing a series of low volatility pieces of data as to who you are, what sex you are, what relationships you're in, how to get hold of you, etc. And the activity list that you want to share in a newsfeed includes, I said I was going to go to this meeting and then changed my mind. The meeting moved place, the meeting was canceled. Every event is just one of those. Every group could be a department, a function. So the newsfeed was nothing more than a record of changes to the other elements that make a social network. Okay? If I then say every social network only consists of those 5 things, the directory, the relationships, the ability to communicate in different ways between those elements, the ability to schedule, and the record of changes, it would appear simple, but that's not yet a platform. Facebook didn't become a platform the way it did by stopping at those 5, because the 6th thing was the most important, which was there was what they call, and now I've got to use the word in a software sense, a developer platform was there, which was that the first 5 pieces were exposed in ways that other people, because it was a platform that I am standing on, could build things on top. So they set up some very simple rules to say, here are the things that you can do. Right? Nobody can use a Facebook app as a Facebook app. And most of you probably recognize there are 2 types of apps, those that are actually owned and sponsored and set up by Facebook, and those that are built by third parties. Why are third parties important? Because human beings don't scale. Okay? There is still a war for talent. One of the issues that, when I was speaking to Tara about this event in the first place, was saying a change has to take place in the way higher education is being disseminated in this country, because the current model doesn't scale. And if you want to introduce an ability to scale, open innovation is relatively important, which again brings in the need for a Facebook-like platform. For Facebook, read the concepts. But when you read the concepts, the cheapest way may be Facebook itself, because someone's already done a number of these things. But that's the way you think of it. I don't own any stock in Facebook. I don't intend to. Right? As far as I'm concerned, a lot of my friends work there. I enjoy it, but that doesn't mean that it's the only game in town. But it is important, if we talk about public funds, that you find the most, the valuable route to being able to deploy those funds. The app becomes very, very important, because what Facebook then says to everybody else, and you have to think about it when you look at an educational platform, is we will mandate that we will identify the person. Okay? Facebook is responsible for identifying who you are. That's a contract between not the app provider and you, but Facebook and you in a way. A mandate that the apps are at least advertised. So whether you're thinking of courses or departments or faculty or whatever, some central resource has to be able to indicate what's available. It goes further and says, one of the interesting things for me, I'll move from Facebook to the iPhone, is if you actually look at the details of how people build software on the iPhone, there's a lovely little line inside that says, and we want applications to terminate within 5 seconds of the person exiting the app on the iPhone. And if your app doesn't do that, we will. Okay? So there is in the old days it used to be said Steve Jobs personally managed the boot sequence for the Mac to make sure that it stayed within 15 seconds. You couldn't enter anything in. So one of the things a platform does is to set some conventions, some ground rules, some value statements. If you then step back and say, when you're a platform, what do? And please, again, don't think of software. You have to authenticate and verify people. You have to stand in the gap to make sure that people only access those things that they are meant to access, whether it's a medical element or educational or political, it doesn't matter. The confidentiality, privacy elements have to be maintained, and a platform has to achieve that. You've got to choose whether you're going to get involved in the game of actually certifying the apps. Now, for app, read courseware, right? Do you want the Facebook model of saying there is no certification, everybody can just walk in, provided the API is there, or do you want the Apple model to say, no, there is a central kite marking that will take place? Okay? Both models are possible, right? Do you host things? In Facebook, when you build an app, you're responsible for hosting it. On the iPhone, when you build an app, the guy who owns the device is responsible for hosting it. Virtual, educational environments, you can outsource the hosting of the application to being run via the cloud onto the edge device. But these models, you have to think about whether you participate in the performance guarantees of it or not. So I'm going to end with that just to say, when you think platforms, don't think of them strictly as a series of bits in software terms. Think about them as places that create liquidity because there is some content or some service, some preeminent service out there that brings a whole people together. That creates the marketplace that Tara referred to quite a few times, because while they may come there for a purpose, the interactions may and should exceed that purpose. New value is created because you've defined. Two of the things I always hear about for innovation is innovation takes place at the edge of well-bounded domains. Also, that innovators quite often are those who leave the discipline that they originally trained in and apply that learning in some other new discipline. Because you're less likely to carry the anchors and frames of what you did beforehand. That is as true for the platform. Right? In a platform, manage the people who are involved, keep the standards in order to be able to interact with others and interoperate, guarantee the performances that you need to for the things you choose to, but most importantly, keep it open enough for other people that you do not know to create value on top. One of my favorite sayings is, talent is building things that other people cannot build. Genius is building things that other people cannot see. Okay? As educationalists, one of the things is to create platforms that will help people build things that none of us can see. Thank you.